The Fort Bragg Cartel. This video is based on key insights from the book The Fort Bragg Cartel by Seth Harp. Chapter 1, I Kill People for a Living. Seth Harp begins a troubling story about two Special Forces soldiers, Mark Leshikar and William Lavigne II, returning from a trip to Disney World in March 2018. The investigation quickly reveals a pattern of troubling behavior and hints at a deeper corruption within America's elite military units. The men were deeply affected by drug use, a mix of prescription pills, cocaine, and dangerous bath salts, and Leshikar was convinced someone was following them. This wasn't just a bad trip. It was the beginning of unraveling a story about hidden problems within the Special Forces. Harp details Leshikar's descent into instability, tracing it back to a mysterious incident during a deployment to Tajikistan, a country known for drug trafficking. While the military downplayed the event, Leshikar returned home changed, suffering from what appeared to be a traumatic brain injury. He became reliant on painkillers and anti-anxiety medication, but also turned to cocaine, claiming it was common among Green Berets to stay awake during missions. His family noticed a disturbing shift in his personality, marked by mood swings and a dark admission. I kill people for a living. This illustrates a troubling pattern of soldiers self-medicating and grappling with the moral weight of their actions. The author introduces Lavigne as a highly decorated Delta Force soldier, a unit even more secretive than the Green Berets, tasked with covert operations and assassinations. Harp emphasizes the culture within Delta Force, where drug use was rampant and a sense of impunity reigned. Lavigne, it turns out, was a key figure in supplying cocaine to his fellow soldiers, operating out of his home in Fayetteville, North Carolina, near Fort Bragg. This reveals a systemic problem. A unit responsible for national security was plagued by illegal activity and substance abuse. Harp paints a picture of a tight-knit group of Delta Force operators who openly bragged about their exploits and engaged in reckless behavior. The author highlights the contrast between those who lived by the rules and those who were complete derelicts, constantly involved in shady activities. This division within the unit suggests a breakdown in discipline and accountability. The narrative also introduces Jens Merritt, a Marine-turned-Delta Force soldier, who appears to be a supervisor of Lavigne and potentially aware of the drug use. The story takes a darker turn as Harp reveals Leshikar's increasingly erratic behavior, culminating in a violent outburst at a birthday party where he nearly harmed his sister. Despite a promise to get clean, the trip to Disney World became another opportunity for drug use, fueled by Lavigne. The author details the journey home, marked by Leshikar's paranoia and Lavigne's attempts to obtain more drugs, stopping at questionable locations near military bases. This demonstrates how easily access to drugs and a culture of secrecy allowed these soldiers to continue their destructive habits. Finally, Harp describes the explosive confrontation at Lavigne's home. Leshikar, convinced the car was bugged, began dismantling the engine, triggering a fight with Lavigne. The scene, witnessed by the two young daughters, underscores the danger and instability caused by the soldiers' actions. Harp sets the stage for a deeper investigation into the circumstances surrounding this incident, hinting at a cover-up and a network of corruption within the Special Forces. The author's detailed account suggests that this is not an isolated incident, but a symptom of a much larger problem. Chapter 2, They Do What They Want. Seth Harp unfolds a disturbing account of the events following the shooting of Mark Leshikar by William Lavigne, both members of the elite Special Forces. The chapter details how a potential murder case was quickly and systematically downplayed and ultimately dismissed, revealing a pattern of protection afforded to members of this highly secretive unit. Lavigne, after shooting Leshikar, initially lied to authorities, first claiming suicide, then an unknown intruder, before settling on a self-defense story involving a screwdriver. This shifting narrative, Harp illustrates, was readily accepted by local law enforcement despite glaring inconsistencies and a lack of supporting evidence. The narrative highlights a troubling lack of thorough investigation. Crucially, Lavigne wasn't properly processed after the shooting. No arrest, booking, or standard procedures like drug testing were followed. This preferential treatment, Harp suggests, stemmed from Lavigne's position within Delta Force and a network of influence extending into the Fayetteville community, including a clandestine gathering spot for soldiers. The author points to a recent case where similar connections helped a fellow Delta Force member avoid serious consequences in a rape case, hinting at a system where these operators operate above the law. Harp meticulously reconstructs the scene through the eyewitness account of Leshikar's 6-year-old daughter, Melanie. Her testimony, corroborated by forensic evidence, paints a picture of Lavigne circling and repeatedly shooting an unarmed Leshikar, even after he fell. Despite this, authorities clung to Lavigne's self-defense claim. The author emphasizes the bizarre detail of a piece of Leshikar's flesh being found stuck to the kitchen ceiling, a detail that further undermines the narrative of a simple struggle. The investigation by the Army's Criminal Investigation Division, CID, is presented by Harp as a further attempt to cover up the truth. CID agents, he argues, manufactured evidence, specifically attempting to place a gun in Leshikar's hand based on a questionable interview with Melanie, despite her consistent statements to family that her father wasn't armed. Harp details how the agency ignored evidence contradicting their chosen narrative and ultimately endorsed the self-defense claim, effectively closing the case. Harp reveals a disturbing pattern of obstruction and manipulation. Leshikar's cell phone was withheld from investigators by Jens Merritt, a key figure in the cover-up, and later wiped clean. The author notes the presence of Lavigne's Delta Force teammates at Leshikar's wake, their intimidating behavior suggesting a clear message to anyone considering pursuing justice. The chapter concludes with a sense of outrage and a clear implication that the Leshikar case is just one example of a larger problem. A culture of impunity within America's special forces, where crimes are covered up and justice is denied. Harp's writing suggests this is part of a broader investigation into unsolved crimes and corruption within these elite military units. Chapter 3, Fayettenam. Seth Harp begins by tracing the origins of Delta Force, America's most selective special operations unit, founded in 1977. Inspired by the British SAS, Delta Force was created to handle incredibly difficult and dangerous missions, like rescuing hostages or stopping terrorists. Colonel Charles Beckwith, a key founder, had learned from the British during the Vietnam War, witnessing their aggressive tactics. Early missions, like Project Delta in Vietnam, involved risky operations behind enemy lines. However, the unit's first major test, Operation Eagle Claw, a hostage rescue in Iran, was a disaster, damaging President Carter's reputation. Harp details how this failure led to a significant change under President Reagan. The creation of the Joint Special Operations Command, or JSOC, was a turning point, establishing a centralized command for special operations. Delta Force became the core of JSOC, alongside other elite units like SEAL Team 6 and specialized aviation and intelligence groups. This new structure gave the president direct access to these forces, bypassing traditional military bureaucracy. Harp emphasizes that this was a secret development, happening without public announcement. The author explains that the rise of JSOC coincided with a decline in the CIA's reputation due to revealed abuses in the 1970s, including illegal activities and questionable experiments. This created an opportunity for the military, through JSOC, to take over some of the CIA's covert operations, but with less oversight from Congress. Vice President George H.W. Bush, with his deep intelligence background, played a key role in this shift. During the Reagan years, JSOC was used in secret wars in Central America and elsewhere, sometimes linked to drug trafficking, as highlighted by the Iran-Contra affair. Harp points out that while JSOC was presented as a response to the failures of Operation Eagle Claw, another factor was the desire to avoid the scrutiny faced by the CIA. The author notes that the military's clandestine activities are generally subject to less regulation than those of civilian agencies. The New York Times reported on JSOC's existence in 1988, raising concerns that it could become a uniformed CIA, operating outside of normal checks and balances. The narrative then shifts to the post-9/11 era. Harp reveals a surprising connection between the events of 9/11 and a former U.S. Army Special Forces soldier, Ali Abdul Sayed Mohammed. Mohammed, who trained with the CIA and Delta Force, later became a key figure in al-Qaeda, providing the terrorist group with crucial training and knowledge based on his U.S. military experience. He essentially wrote al-Qaeda's training manual, drawing from his Green Beret instruction. Harp suggests that Mohammed's story reveals a complex and troubling history of U.S. involvement in the origins of the very threat it now fights. Harp describes how the Bush administration used the attacks of 9/11 to expand the powers of JSOC and authorize assassinations. The war in Afghanistan, initially aimed at dismantling al-Qaeda, quickly became entangled with local warlords, some of whom had questionable backgrounds, including involvement in the drug trade. The author highlights the irony of the U.S. partnering with individuals with criminal histories in the pursuit of its goals. The author concludes by focusing on a series of unsolved murders at Fort Bragg in 2002, where 4 Army wives were killed by their husbands, all Special Forces soldiers recently returned from Afghanistan. Harp suggests that these tragedies were not simply isolated incidents, but potentially linked to the stresses and trauma of war. He details how the Army attempted to deflect blame by promoting a false narrative about the anti-malarial drug mefloquine, claiming it caused psychosis and aggression. Harp argues that this was a deliberate attempt to cover up the deeper issues of violence and mental health within the Special Forces community. Harp suggests that the events at Fort Bragg reveal a pattern of problems that have been hidden for too long. Chapter 4, Don't Call Me Your Husband. The chapter begins with Billy Lavine's decision to join the Army in early 2001, a time when war with Iraq was being discussed, but not yet a major focus. Harp details Lavine's upbringing in Michigan's remote Upper Peninsula, a place known for its tough people and harsh winters. His childhood friend, Ben Bowden, describes him as someone who struggled in school and was self-conscious about his crossed eyes. This insecurity became a key factor in his decision to enlist, as the Army offered free LASIK eye surgery, a procedure his family couldn't afford. Harp points out this program was a significant recruiting tool, especially for those with limited financial resources. As Harp explains, the 9/11 attacks dramatically changed Lavine's trajectory. He'd already completed basic training and was in specialized training when the attacks happened, quickly realizing he would be going to war. The author emphasizes that the conflict would last for 2 decades and span the globe, a reality Lavine couldn't have foreseen when he signed up. Harp notes Lavine physically transformed during this time, becoming much stronger and more imposing. Lavine met his future wife, Jamie Carter, in Tacoma, Washington, near Fort Lewis. Harp describes Tacoma as a struggling city heavily reliant on the military. Jamie recalls Lavine being shy and awkward, but she was drawn to him. They quickly became a couple, and just before Lavine's deployment to Iraq in November 2003, they hastily married. Harp highlights the common practice of soldiers entering into quick marriages for financial benefits, hinting at potential issues within the relationship. Harp then shifts to the political context of the Iraq War, detailing how the Bush administration built a case for invasion based on false claims about weapons of mass destruction and ties between Saddam Hussein and al-Qaeda. He emphasizes the lack of evidence supporting these claims and the United Nations' refusal to authorize the war. Lavine's unit was deployed to Samarra, Iraq, a city that quickly became a hotbed of insurgent activity. Harp details the increasing number of American casualties in the region, painting a picture of a dangerous and escalating conflict. Upon returning home around Thanksgiving 2004, Lavine was a changed man. Harp describes him as hardened and distant, lacking the innocence he once possessed. He immediately told Jamie he wanted a divorce, claiming he needed to focus on his ambition to join the Special Forces. Harp suggests this abrupt change, and the reasoning behind it were suspect, pointing to the possibility of a sham marriage and the emotional toll of war. Jamie recounts his coldness and his refusal to explain his decision. Harp reveals Lavigne's infidelity during this period, sleeping with one of Jamie's friends, further illustrating his altered character. Jamie's reaction, a public outburst at a local bar, demonstrates her anger and heartbreak. She ultimately signed the divorce papers and watched Lavigne leave to begin training for the Special Forces at Fort Bragg. Harp concludes by emphasizing Jamie's lasting emotional scars, setting the stage for a deeper investigation into Lavigne's path and the potential darkness within the Special Forces community. The author subtly introduces the core theme of the investigation: the troubling consequences of war and the potential for corruption and unsolved crimes within elite military units. Chapter 5: Pipe Hitters. Seth Harp begins by detailing how, 3 years after the 9/11 attacks, the Joint Special Operations Command, or JSOC, was still a relatively small part of the military. However, its role was quickly growing as the United States became involved in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Initially, Delta Force was tasked with finding weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, but that search proved fruitless. They then shifted their focus to capturing or killing key leaders from Saddam Hussein's former government, successfully locating and eliminating Saddam's sons and eventually Saddam himself. As security in Iraq worsened, especially in Baghdad, and a Delta Force interrogation site faced scrutiny due to the Abu Ghraib torture scandal, the Special Operations Task Force moved its headquarters to Camp Anaconda, a large airbase near Balad. There, they created a secret, high-tech command center inside a massive aircraft hangar. This center was filled with analysts, intelligence officers, and personnel from various agencies, including the CIA and FBI, all working closely with Delta Force. Remarkably, regular soldiers stationed at Camp Anaconda were unaware of this hidden operation happening right under their noses, a fact Harp knows firsthand as he was one of those soldiers. He notes the secrecy was deliberate, with JSOC intentionally separated from conventional troops, a practice emphasized by General Stanley McChrystal. The chapter then shifts to the deteriorating situation in Iraq in 2006, marked by escalating violence and sectarian killings. President Bush, seeking a new strategy, turned to officials within the Special Operations community. These officials proposed a plan that would dramatically change how the United States waged war, and would eventually make Fort Bragg, North Carolina, the central hub for covert operations. Stanley McChrystal emerged as a key figure in this shift. He believed the enemy wasn't simply a nationalist rebellion, but part of a larger global terrorist network. He coined the term Al-Qaeda in Iraq, or AQI, to describe this enemy, even though the connection to Osama bin Laden's Al-Qaeda was weak. Harp points out that McChrystal admitted JSOC exaggerated Al-Qaeda's role in Iraq to justify a more aggressive approach. McChrystal and his deputy, William McRaven, convinced President Bush to authorize a massive increase in targeted assassinations, reminiscent of the controversial Phoenix program during the Vietnam War. This hidden surge, as it was called, involved expanding the list of targets to include anyone suspected of opposing American forces. The author explains that JSOC became a killing machine, carrying out 10-night raids per day at its peak. The chapter highlights the use of technology, like cell phone interception, and the lack of Arabic language skills within JSOC, suggesting many targets were chosen based on flawed intelligence and guesswork. Harp details how Delta Force employed increasingly deceptive tactics, disguising themselves as various individuals, Red Cross workers, businessmen, even women, to get close to their targets. He shares disturbing Instagram posts from a former Delta Force Sergeant Major, Jesse Bocher, showcasing photos of his team and a whiteboard covered with mugshots, most crossed out, indicating those individuals had been killed. Bocher's posts also reveal the team's use of drugs, including amphetamines and sleeping pills, to cope with the intense operational tempo. The author notes that this reliance on drugs was widespread within JSOC. The chapter concludes by explaining that while the surge led to a temporary decrease in attacks in 2008, it was largely due to truces and deals with local groups. President Bush declared it a victory, and McChrystal's reputation soared. When President Obama took office, he inherited a failing war in Afghanistan and, influenced by McChrystal's approach, authorized another surge, this time focused on covert operations. Harp emphasizes that Obama's smart war meant expanding the use of black ops, and that this led to Lavine's assignment to Delta Force and his subsequent prescription for dextroamphetamine. Chapter 6, The Killing Fest. Seth Harp begins by detailing Billy Lavine's background, a man who would later become a central figure in a troubling pattern of events within Delta Force. Lavine, after a divorce, underwent rigorous Special Forces training, learning languages like Tagalog and honing skills in areas like parachuting and combat. He was stationed in Okinawa, Japan, and completed numerous deployments, though official records are incomplete, obscuring the full extent of his early military service. Harp points out a curious detail. Lavine's record shows advanced land navigation, a coded way of noting attempts to join the elite Delta Force, a unit notoriously difficult to get into. The selection process for Delta Force, Harp explains, is brutal. It involves a grueling 40-mile march with a heavy pack, designed to push candidates to their physical limits. But it's not just about strength. The selection board also looks for a specific personality type, introverted individuals who can become extroverted when needed, creative thinkers, and team players who aren't necessarily inclined to follow the crowd. Former Delta Force members describe it as a good old boys club, where fitting in is as important as skill. Mark Leshikar, a friend of Lavine's, attempted to join but was rejected, reportedly due to a volatile temper and rumors of misconduct in Afghanistan. Interestingly, even someone like Lavine, who eventually did make it into Delta Force, was flagged by a retired lieutenant colonel as having potential psychological issues. Despite these concerns, he was accepted. Harp then shifts focus to the broader context of the war in Afghanistan under General McChrystal. McChrystal introduced a program called F3EAD, essentially a surge in secret operations, and dramatically expanded the definition of enemy combatant. This meant Delta Force was authorized to kill more people, including native-born Afghans, not just foreign fighters. The author details how the U.S. propped up a corrupt Afghan government led by Hamid Karzai, riddled with drug traffickers and funded by American money. McChrystal even acknowledged supporting a drug cartel in the Helmand province, highlighting the morally questionable alliances the U.S. made during the war. The pace of night raids increased dramatically, with JSOC teams, including Delta Force, Navy SEALs, and Army Rangers, conducting surprise attacks with little reliable intelligence. Harp reveals a shocking statistic. Over half of those killed or captured by JSOC were targeted by mistake. To hide the rising death toll, McChrystal stopped publicly reporting body counts while simultaneously lecturing other soldiers about avoiding civilian casualties. The author notes the irony of McChrystal's downfall, brought about by a Rolling Stone article detailing his and his staff's behavior, and the subsequent conspiracy theories surrounding the reporter Michael Hastings's death. Following McChrystal's removal, Vice Admiral William McRaven took command of JSOC. Harp describes McRaven as less reflective than McChrystal, with a more aggressive approach to eliminating perceived threats. The author points out the historical imbalance within JSOC, where the Army-dominated Delta Force often overshadowed the Navy's SEAL Team 6. The raid that killed Osama bin Laden briefly elevated SEAL Team 6's profile, but it also led to unwanted scrutiny and a series of scandals. Harp details how investigations revealed disturbing behavior within SEAL Team 6, including allegations of unlawful killings, corpse mutilation, and drug use. These revelations, published in the New York Times and The Intercept, painted a picture of a unit operating with impunity and a disturbing disregard for the rules of war. The author concludes by highlighting a striking contrast. While SEAL Team 6 faced intense public criticism, Delta Force, despite being equally involved in the controversial Killing Fest in Afghanistan, remained largely out of the spotlight, suggesting a deliberate effort to shield the Army's elite unit from scrutiny. Harp's narrative sets the stage for a deeper investigation into the dark side of America's special forces, hinting at a pattern of unsolved crimes and corruption. Chapter 7: Alleged Mexican White. Seth Harp begins to unravel a troubling story surrounding the actions of American special forces in Afghanistan, specifically focusing on a team connected to a soldier named Lavigne. The chapter sets the stage for an investigation into possible wrongdoing, hinting at a connection between the war in Afghanistan, a rise in heroin trafficking, and unsolved crimes back home. Harp details the dangerous environment in Afghanistan during Lavigne's 2011 deployment, following the death of Osama bin Laden. Night raids were increasing, but victory felt distant, and the situation was incredibly risky for soldiers. Harp highlights a series of deaths within Lavigne's unit and related special forces groups. Master Sergeant Stevenson was killed in a battle, and 2 other Delta Force soldiers died under mysterious circumstances. These deaths, along with a growing number of drug overdoses among Special Forces personnel, raise red flags. A disturbing pattern emerges, suggesting a darker side to the operations in Afghanistan. The author notes that soldiers were sometimes found dead from drug overdoses, even at highly secure bases. The chapter paints a picture of the secretive world of Joint Special Operations Command, JSOC, a powerful organization with a large presence in Afghanistan. Harp explains that JSOC operated with significant autonomy, answering to the highest levels of the U.S. government. This level of secrecy makes it difficult to investigate potential misconduct. He describes the work of Lavigne's team as mowing the lawn, a chilling euphemism for dangerous and likely illegal operations. Harp then shifts focus to the surprising reality of Afghanistan, becoming a major producer of heroin during the U.S. occupation. He points out that opium production soared after the Taliban was removed from power. While the Taliban had previously banned poppy cultivation, its absence led to a massive increase in heroin production. Afghanistan quickly became the world's leading source of heroin, far surpassing countries like Mexico and Myanmar. The author reveals a puzzling contradiction in the Drug Enforcement Administration's DEA reports. Despite the overwhelming evidence of Afghan heroin flooding the global market, the DEA consistently claimed that almost no heroin consumed in the United States came from Afghanistan, instead blaming Mexico. Harp argues that the DEA's methods for tracking heroin origins were flawed and biased, leading to inaccurate conclusions. He specifically criticizes the DEA's practice of labeling a large percentage of seized heroin as alleged Mexican white, despite its unusual purity and color. Harp introduces evidence suggesting the DEA may have been intentionally downplaying the role of Afghan heroin. A White House report questioned the DEA's statistics, finding them unreliable and prone to error. The author notes that after this report, the DEA stopped mentioning Afghanistan in its annual threat assessments. This silence raises suspicions about a deliberate attempt to hide the truth. Finally, Harp exposes the deep corruption within the Afghan government, revealing that officials at all levels were involved in the drug trade. He explains that the U.S. largely ignored this corruption and even partnered with known drug traffickers, prioritizing political goals over fighting the drug trade. The CIA, in particular, is accused of working with individuals involved in the heroin business. Harp concludes that the U.S. occupation inadvertently created a massive narcotics boom, with potentially devastating consequences for both Afghanistan and the United States. He suggests that this connection to the drug trade may be linked to the unsolved crimes and corruption within America's special forces that he is investigating. Chapter 8: The Northern Distribution Network. Seth Harp begins by detailing Billy Lavigne's return to Afghanistan in 2013, a time still fraught with danger. The chapter quickly focuses on the tragic death of Ryan James Savard, a Delta Force soldier killed in the remote province of Condensed. Harp explains that Condensed, near Tajikistan, became a hotspot for casualties due to a new bridge built by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. This bridge, intended to boost trade, unintentionally opened a major route for drug trafficking. Harp reveals a troubling connection between the U.S.-funded Northern Distribution Network, designed to secure supply lines for the war, and the flow of heroin. The author explains that the Pentagon invested heavily in Tajikistan's military, which was then used to move Afghan opium across borders. A significant portion of the heroin produced in Afghanistan during the U.S. occupation traveled this route, with Condensed acting as a critical control point. This explains the intense fighting in the area, as Delta Force tried to operate within this complex and corrupt system. The narrative then shifts to the increasing difficulties faced by JSOC, Joint Special Operations Command, during this period. Harp notes a reduction in assassinations due to the challenging terrain and the Afghan resistance learning to avoid surveillance. Intelligence gathering became less effective, and soldiers felt they were simply creating statistics rather than making a real impact. This led to frustration and a sense of futility among those on the ground. Harp highlights a disturbing trend of problems back home, including a high number of suicides, drug overdoses, and a particularly unsettling murder. Sergeant First Class Sean Wayne Wells, a Green Beret, was executed in his home, and the crime remains unsolved. This incident foreshadows a pattern of darkness and unanswered questions that Harp will explore further. The author introduces Valeria Zavala, a psychological operations specialist who deployed with Delta Force. Through her perspective, Harp provides a glimpse into the intense culture of these elite soldiers. Zavala describes their eagerness for combat and a disturbing lack of remorse. She recounts a chilling anecdote about an operator bringing a piece of a victim's brain back to base, illustrating the brutal reality of their work. Harp details the end of the official war in Afghanistan in 2014, but emphasizes that the conflict continued in a hidden form. Despite President Obama's declaration of victory, violence persisted, and the JSOC-led Special Operations Task Force remained in place, operating largely out of public view. The author points out the lack of media access, making it easier for the U.S. government to wage war without scrutiny. The narrative then turns to the ethical decay within the Special Forces community. Harp shares accounts from Lauren Gray, an Army wife, who describes widespread corruption, including theft of government funds, drug dealing, and abuse. Soldiers were reportedly using their positions to enrich themselves, with little fear of consequences. Harp illustrates this with examples of soldiers purchasing luxury items with stolen money and a general disregard for the law. Harp introduces Timothy James Dumas SR, a quartermaster who became entangled in a web of corruption. Dumas, a logistics expert, discovered a scheme involving a fraudulent trucking company, Hikmatullah Shadman's Hikmat, and the misuse of government funds. He attempted to use this information to his advantage during a drug test investigation, but his efforts were met with skepticism. The author reveals that Dumas began writing a letter detailing a larger conspiracy involving drug smuggling at Fort Bragg and the Kandahar airfield. This letter, according to Harp, contained information about Special Forces soldiers involved in trafficking drugs. Harp concludes by suggesting that this network had been operating for years, with a disturbing level of impunity. Chapter 9, Rise and Kill First. Seth Harp begins a deep dive into the shadowy world of America's Special Forces, starting with Billy Lavine's life after his second marriage in 2013. Lavine, a highly decorated soldier, married Michelle Yuki, also in the military, and they had a daughter, Ava. Soon after, Lavine was deployed to Niger, a country in Africa, as part of a shift in the War on Terror strategy. Harp explains this shift wasn't just about changing locations, but a widening of the rules, allowing Special Operations Forces to secretly operate in almost any country, chasing down suspected terrorists. This expansion began with secret orders in the early 2000s, giving JSOC, the Joint Special Operations Command, broad powers. The author details how political motivations also played a role. Harp reveals a surprising connection between talk of an Arab Spring in the early 2000s, encouraged by some in the U.S. government, and the later chaos in Libya. The U.S., along with NATO, intervened in Libya, leading to the death of Muammar Gaddafi. However, this intervention didn't lead to stability. Instead, it created a power vacuum filled by armed groups and spread weapons across North Africa, contributing to the instability in places like Niger. Harp argues this created more problems than it solved, but also provided justification for expanding special operations activities in Africa. Harp points out that despite the apparent failures, the military-industrial complex, the close relationship between the military and companies that make weapons, benefited from the ongoing conflicts. This fueled a continuous need for special operations forces, and Lavine's deployment to Niger was part of this expansion. His role wasn't as a fighter, but as a trainer, a relatively calm period for him after years of combat. However, Harp foreshadows that this peace wouldn't last, as events in Iraq and Syria were about to pull Lavine back into intense fighting. The author then shifts focus to the secretive operations carried out by JSOC in Syria and Iraq, starting in the early 2000s. Harp describes clandestine missions, including spying and raids, and the U.S. government's support for groups opposing the Syrian president, Bashar al-Assad. A billion-dollar CIA program, Timber Sycamore, funneled weapons into Syria, contributing to the rise of ISIS. Harp emphasizes that ISIS wasn't simply a spontaneous movement, but was formed in part by former Iraqi soldiers and fueled by weapons and money of uncertain origin. Harp details how President Obama authorized more special operations forces, but maintained a public narrative of limited involvement. The author challenges this narrative, explaining how accounting tricks were used to hide the true number of troops on the ground. He describes a network of secret bases and the use of proxy forces, like the Kurdish SDF, to carry out operations. He illustrates this with his own experience in Syria, observing the presence of numerous American commandos operating with a high degree of secrecy. The narrative then turns to Lavine's return to Iraq in 2015 and the formation of the Expeditionary Targeting Force, ETF, a highly secretive unit dedicated to assassinating suspected terrorists. Harp reveals that this unit operated with unprecedented secrecy, even by special operations standards. He highlights the loosening of rules of engagement under President Trump, which allowed for more aggressive tactics and less oversight. The author points to incidents like the near bombing of the Tabqa Dam in Syria as examples of reckless behavior. Harp introduces a darker side to the story, detailing Lavine's personal struggles after returning from deployments. His marriage fell apart, and he turned to alcohol and drugs, including cocaine and heroin. The author describes a culture of drug use within the special operations community, fueled by trauma and a sense of invulnerability. He explains how operators circumvented drug testing and engaged in risky behavior. Harp introduces characters like Mark Leshikar, a fellow soldier who idolized Lavine and contributed to the dangerous atmosphere. The author paints a picture of a tight-knit group of operators who engaged in illegal activities, including drug dealing and reckless behavior. Harp reveals that Lavine became a drug dealer, supplying other soldiers, and that the group fostered a competitive, macho culture. The narrative suggests that the pressures of war, combined with a lack of accountability, created a breeding ground for corruption and misconduct within the special forces. Harp sets the stage for a deeper investigation into the events surrounding the death of Mark Leshikar, hinting at a cover-up and a system that protects its own. Chapter 10, Cover Girls. Seth Harp begins an exploration into the world of Delta Force, revealing a surprising contrast between the huge amounts of money spent on this elite military group and the rundown condition of the base where they work, Fort Bragg. Despite billions of dollars, barracks are moldy and streets are full of potholes, leading Harp to question where the funds are actually going. He describes the secretive headquarters of Delta Force, known as the Building, a heavily guarded compound where even NASCAR drivers and golfers need permission and a phone check to enter. The Building is a busy place, with around 2,000 people working there, many of them civilians. Harp details the facility's helicopter pads, shooting ranges, and even a dog kennel, and the unusual sight of motorcycles parked alongside government vehicles. Inside, visitors are constantly watched by cameras and microphones. The author notes a recent upgrade to the commander's offices, funded after a perceived slight from President Obama. Harp then lists a succession of Delta Force commanders, highlighting their backgrounds and career paths, showing a pattern of advancement within the special operations community. Harp moves on to describe the daily life within the building, including a well-stocked dining facility with surprisingly luxurious touches like ice sculptures. The core of Delta Force consists of 4 squadrons, each with its own unique atmosphere, including bars and recreational areas. He emphasizes a relaxed attitude towards rules, like smoking indoors, and a culture of disregard for regulations. Beneath the main building lies a network of tunnels, built as a shelter in case of nuclear war. The basement houses support staff, including an intelligence squadron and a secretive group known as the Cover Girls. This is where Harp's investigation begins to focus on potential wrongdoing. Courtney Williams, a former Army interrogator and Arabic linguist, was hired in 2010 to create fake identities for Delta Force operators. Harp explains that the unit needed convincing backstories, passports, and financial records to allow operators to travel and work undercover without being traced back to the U.S. government. Williams's job involved obtaining these documents through agreements with agencies like the State Department, sometimes even using questionable methods. Williams discovered a disturbing pattern. The unit seemed to prioritize physical appearance when hiring for the Cover Girls team, favoring young, attractive, blonde women. Harp points out the lack of diversity within Delta Force itself, noting it is overwhelmingly white and male. He details a culture of sexism and harassment within the unit, with operators routinely making inappropriate advances towards female staff. Williams faced retaliation after filing complaints, eventually leading to her forced medical retirement. The author then introduces the case of Mark Leshikar, a Green Beret whose death was quickly ruled a justified homicide after an altercation with Billy Lavine, a Delta Force operator. Harp suggests a cover-up, noting the close relationships between Delta Force members, local law enforcement, and influential figures in the community. He describes a network of connections that allowed the unit to operate with impunity, shielding its members from accountability. Harp illustrates how the unit would quickly intervene to protect its personnel when they faced legal trouble, using its influence to suppress negative publicity. Harp concludes by describing a secret off-base location, Warehouse 13, used by Delta Force for parties and gatherings, further emphasizing the unit's secretive and insulated world. The chapter lays the groundwork for a deeper investigation into the alleged crimes and corruption within America's most elite Special Forces unit, hinting at a pattern of misconduct and a culture of protecting its own. Chapter 11, Warehouse 13. Seth Harp begins a deep dive into a troubling story, revealing a pattern of misconduct within America's elite Special Forces. The chapter centers on Erin Scanlon, a young Army officer stationed at Fort Bragg, and her encounter with a world of secretive military culture and alleged criminal behavior. Harp introduces Scanlon's background and ambition, setting the stage for a night that would change her life. The narrative quickly introduces the complex world of military motorcycle clubs, like Coast X Coast, populated by Special Forces operators. Harp explains these clubs weren't the typical outlaw biker gangs, but rather social groups for soldiers, often blurring the lines between duty and personal life. Chris Valley, a Delta Force sergeant and the leader of Coast X Coast, emerges as a central figure, charismatic, attention-seeking, and ultimately accused of a serious crime. Harp details Valley's public appearances and seemingly unchecked behavior, hinting at a culture of impunity within the special operations community. Harp meticulously builds the scene of the night Scanlan met Valley, highlighting the charitable event and the growing connection between the two. He emphasizes the casual, flirtatious atmosphere, contrasting it with the darker undercurrents of the environment. The description of Warehouse 13, the location of an after-party, is particularly striking, a rundown, secluded space that foreshadows the events to come. Harp notes the questionable legality of the warehouse's operation, pointing to ignored warnings from local authorities. The core of the chapter details the alleged sexual assault of Scanlan by Valley. Harp presents the events with sensitivity, relying on Scanlan's account and police reports. He emphasizes the power imbalance between the two, and Scanlan's feeling of being ambushed and overpowered. The aftermath is equally important, detailing Scanlan's immediate reporting of the assault and the beginning of a frustrating legal battle. Harp then exposes a disturbing pattern of interference in the case. He reveals how Army officials attempted to move the case to a military trial, potentially offering a more favorable outcome for Valley. This intervention, Harp suggests, was driven by a desire to protect the reputation of the Special Forces. The author details the questionable tactics employed during Valley's court-martial, including a weak prosecution and the controversial testimony forced from Scanlan's own lawyer. The chapter concludes with Valley's acquittal and the repercussions for those who tried to expose the truth. Harp highlights the silencing of Lindsay Knapp, a victim advocate who raised concerns about the trial's irregularities. Harp paints a picture of a system designed to protect its own, even at the expense of justice for victims. The author suggests this case is not isolated, but part of a larger pattern of misconduct and corruption within America's special forces, hinting at further investigations to come. Harp's writing suggests a troubling reality where elite soldiers operate with a sense of entitlement and are shielded from accountability. Chapter 12, He Was Seeing Bad Things. Following the fallout from Mark Leshikar's death, Billy Lavigne found himself back with his mother, Judy, in Hope Mills, North Carolina. Seth Harp details how Lavigne was deeply upset, repeatedly telling his mother he hadn't wanted things to end the way they did, and that he'd tried to get help. Judy, a hardworking Walmart employee, always believed in her son and felt he was pushed to this point. Harp notes she held onto a letter from Lavigne's commanding officer in Iraq, Major Davidson, who saw potential in Lavigne and predicted his success. However, Judy observed a significant decline in her son's mental state after Leshikar's death, attributing it to post-traumatic stress disorder. Jordan Terrell, a fellow soldier, learned of Leshikar's death while in training and reacted strongly, needing to cope with the news. Harp recounts Terrell's subsequent meeting with Lavigne on a beach in Wilmington, where Lavigne presented a story mirroring the one he'd told Nicole Rick. Leshikar had spiraled into drug use and paranoia, believing he was being targeted by the government. Terrell found inconsistencies in Lavigne's account, sensing a carefully constructed facade. Harp emphasizes Lavigne's ability to appear calm and collected even in difficult situations. The narrative then shifts to Lavigne's continued struggles with substance abuse and his increasingly erratic behavior. Harp reveals that Lavigne admitted to cocaine use shortly after Leshikar's death, yet remained on active duty in Delta Force. His father, Bill S.R., noticed a disturbing change in his son, describing him as withdrawn and lost in thought. A 4th of July fireworks display proved overwhelming for Lavigne, triggering anxiety and a need to escape the crowds. Harp highlights the contrast between Lavigne's decorated military career and his deteriorating mental health. Harp details Lavigne's attempt to seek forgiveness from Tammy Mabey, Leshikar's mother, but his story again focused on the screwdriver narrative, which may be refuted with the medical examiner's report. This further exposed the inconsistencies in Lavigne's account. The author then reveals Lavigne's arrest in August 2018 for manufacturing crack cocaine, uncovering a cache of weapons in his home, including a sniper rifle. Despite these serious charges, the case mysteriously disappeared from the court docket, a pattern Harp suggests was common for Lavigne. Lavigne was eventually removed from Delta Force and reassigned to a less demanding role, but his behavior continued to be problematic. Harp cites a report from the commander of this unit, who expressed concern about the practice of placing troubled operators with criminal histories in positions with limited oversight, fearing a potential for violence. The commander described Lavigne as intimidating and unstable, causing fear among his fellow soldiers. The chapter concludes by introducing Timothy Dumas, another soldier with a troubled past who crossed paths with Lavigne. Harp reveals Dumas' own issues with drug use and accusations of theft, as well as his claims of uncovering corruption within the Special Forces. Dumas allegedly wrote a letter detailing this wrongdoing, intending to use it as leverage to restore his pension. Harp notes that the copy of this letter was entrusted to a state trooper, Freddie Wayne Huff, who was later arrested on drug charges, suggesting the letter's fate remains unknown. Harp paints a picture of a network of individuals connected by secrets, drugs, and a system that seemed to protect its own, even at the expense of justice. Chapter 13, You Can't Make This Shit Up. Seth Harp unveils a disturbing pattern of corruption and criminal activity linked to individuals connected to Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and beyond. The story centers on Freddie Huff, a former law enforcement officer whose life took a dark turn after questioning the true motives behind the war on drugs. Initially a successful K-9 officer and DEA task force member, Huff became disillusioned after a dying colleague hinted at a deliberate failure to stop the drug trade. Huff's career spiraled downward after being fired for ticketing a politically connected individual, leading him to exploit his knowledge of drug trafficking to profit from the very system he once upheld. He began moving large quantities of cocaine, aided by a network of individuals, many with military or law enforcement backgrounds. Harp details how Huff used his expertise to outsmart law enforcement, employing techniques to conceal drugs from detection. The investigation takes a turn when Huff connects with Timothy Dumas, a former soldier with a history of illicit activities. Dumas introduces Huff to a hidden network within the military, a group involved in drug trafficking and other crimes on and around Fort Bragg. This network, comprised of Special Forces soldiers, operated with a degree of impunity, utilizing their training and access to resources for criminal gain. Harp emphasizes the dangerous nature of this group, noting their willingness to use violence to protect their operations. Harp reveals that this military network wasn't just dealing drugs, they were also stealing weapons from Fort Bragg and selling them on the black market. Dumas, a key figure in this operation, possessed a blackmail letter containing damaging information about high-ranking officials and the alleged involvement of soldiers in bringing opium from Afghanistan into the United States. This letter was intended as a safeguard, to be released if anything happened to Dumas. The author highlights the broader context of weapons theft from military bases, citing examples of stolen firearms surfacing in criminal activities across the country. He points out that corrupt soldiers have long been a source of weapons for criminal organizations, particularly Mexican cartels. Through Huff's story, Harp exposes a disturbing reality: the potential for a clandestine criminal enterprise to thrive within the ranks of America's elite special forces, fueled by greed, corruption, and a willingness to exploit their positions of power. The chapter concludes with the introduction of Will Lavigne, another soldier connected to the network, hinting at further layers of deceit and danger to be uncovered. Chapter 14, That Man Worked for the Cartel. Seth Harp delves deeper into the troubling story of Billy Lavigne, a former Army soldier whose life spiraled into drug abuse, criminal activity, and potential connections to a dangerous drug cartel. The investigation reveals a pattern of Lavigne receiving chances to rehabilitate, only to repeatedly fail and slip further into a life of crime, highlighting a systemic issue within the military's handling of soldiers with substance abuse problems. Despite multiple failed attempts at rehab and positive drug tests, Lavigne managed to avoid serious consequences, even securing a favorable discharge that protected his pension. The narrative introduces a network of individuals surrounding Lavigne, painting a picture of a criminal underworld operating in and around Fort Bragg, North Carolina. Lavigne's relationship with Amanda Tostado, an exotic dancer with a lengthy criminal record, draws him closer to Britt and Ray Whittington and Bobby Lee Anderson, both heavily involved in drug trafficking and violent crime. Whittington, in particular, emerges as a central figure, described by neighbors as a major drug dealer and even a human trafficker. Harp illustrates this through specific examples, like Whittington shooting at bail bondsmen and accidentally damaging Lavigne's property, demonstrating a volatile and lawless environment. Harp reveals that Lavigne wasn't simply a user, but actively participated in the drug trade, acting as a supplier and enforcer for his associates. Sources indicate that their supply came directly from a Mexican cartel, a claim supported by multiple informants and the testimony of Sharon Shively, a local figure familiar with Fayetteville's criminal scene. Lavigne's role involved protecting drug deals, collecting debts, and potentially engaging in violence, even while struggling with his own addiction. The author emphasizes Lavigne's constant possession of firearms, reinforcing his dangerous position within this network. The investigation also uncovers Lavigne's peculiar habit of documenting his experiences, hinting at a potential memoir about his time in Delta Force. This raises concerns about the sensitive information he possessed and the potential risks of revealing classified details. Harp points out that Lavigne's continued freedom despite numerous offenses, including a hit-and-run and an assault with a deadly weapon, is deeply troubling. The author suggests a pattern of leniency, possibly due to Lavigne's military background or connections. As the COVID-19 pandemic gripped the nation, Lavigne reconnected with his ex-wife, Jamie Carter, and shockingly confessed to killing his best friend, claiming it was due to a mental breakdown. This confession, delivered via text message, adds another layer of complexity to Lavigne's story and raises questions about the circumstances surrounding the death. Harp notes that Lavigne's attempts to downplay the incident and shift blame are unsettling. The author details how Lavigne continued to evade serious consequences, even after being implicated in a shooting. Despite multiple encounters with law enforcement and clear evidence of his involvement in criminal activity, he consistently managed to avoid prosecution. Harp highlights the frustration of CID agent Jeremy Spear, who repeatedly questioned Lavigne but was unable to secure a statement. The chapter culminates with a chilling encounter between Lavigne and Jessie Marie Lindsley, a tattoo artist and drug user. Lavigne, wearing a ski mask and armed with a crossbow, intended to kill Lindsley's abusive boyfriend. While he was ultimately dissuaded, the incident underscores his descent into violence and his willingness to take extreme measures. Lindsley's confirmation of Lavigne's cartel connections further solidifies the investigation's central claim. Tragically, Lindsley herself would later become a victim of violence, murdered by a protege of Whittington, adding a grim epilogue to Lavigne's story and suggesting a dangerous cycle of crime and retribution. Seth Harp's reporting suggests a deeply flawed system that allowed a troubled soldier to operate with impunity, potentially contributing to a series of unsolved crimes and corruption within America's special forces. Chapter 15, Freddie had everything under control. Seth Harp details how Freddie Huff and Timothy Dumas thrived during the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic, capitalizing on increased demand for drugs, particularly around Fort Bragg. They moved large quantities of cocaine, earning millions, but trouble arose with one of their buyers, Will Lavigne, who owed money and was suspected of being an FBI informant. Dumas was unsure whether to trust Lavigne, a concern for anyone in the drug trade, yet continued to do business with him despite Huff's reservations. Harp portrays Huff as a commanding figure, physically imposing and always well-dressed, yet also someone who aroused suspicion, even being mistaken for a police officer by some associates. A visit to his messy stash house, however, quickly dispelled those doubts, revealing a hub of criminal activity frequented by dangerous individuals and displaying obvious wealth. Huff controlled drug distribution across North Carolina and even into Georgia, according to those who knew him. He lived a lavish lifestyle, filled with expensive cars and constant drug use, but was surprisingly careless with his money. Jaime Rosado, a more cautious drug trafficker, connected Huff and Dumas to a Puerto Rican organization for cocaine supply. Rosado disliked violence and preferred a quiet life, contrasting sharply with the chaotic world of Huff and Dumas. He described Dumas as heavily armed and boastful about past military exploits, even claiming to have smuggled drugs on military planes using special access. Rosado also feared Joey Green, a hitman employed by Dumas, highlighting the dangerous environment they operated in. The author notes both Huff and Dumas were struggling with drug addiction, their habits escalating in 2020. Dumas' behavior became increasingly erratic, and he was even suspected of shooting into an occupied apartment, though charges were dropped. A pattern Harp points out was common for both men. Despite the lack of prosecution, evidence suggests Dumas did fire a shot, narrowly missing a child. Harp reveals a disturbing incident where Huff and Dumas broke into an apartment, claiming to have a search warrant and threatened the residents. While Dumas faced charges, Huff avoided them due to his connections with the local sheriff. This illustrates a pattern of preferential treatment that Harp suggests protected Huff throughout his criminal career, with possible connections to law enforcement. The relationship between Huff and Dumas began to unravel as financial issues and suspicions grew. A significant amount of money disappeared from a Florida property they used for drug transactions, and both men suspected each other. The murder of Joey Green further complicated matters, with Dumas allegedly confessing to killing him and enlisting help to dispose of the body. Dumas' paranoia reached a peak when he became convinced that Will Lavigne was an FBI informant. Despite Huff's attempts to dissuade him, Dumas decided to kill Lavigne, obtaining cocaine from Huff before setting up a meeting. Harp concludes the chapter by establishing Huff's alibi. He was in Texas with a known cartel member, while Dumas headed towards a fateful encounter with Lavigne. Harp's narrative sets the stage for a deeper exploration of corruption and unsolved crimes within the Special Forces community, hinting at a complex web of deceit and violence. Chapter 16, Until Valhalla. Seth Harp begins his investigation into a disturbing pattern of deaths and wrongdoing within America's most elite military units, starting with the murders of William Lavigne and Timothy Dumas near Fort Bragg, North Carolina, in December 2020. Harp paints a picture of Fort Bragg itself as an unappealing place, a training ground where even the local wildlife has adapted to the constant disruption of military exercises. The discovery of Lavigne, a former Delta Force soldier, and Dumas, a chief warrant officer, sets off a complex investigation that quickly reveals a web of drug dealing, blackmail, and potential cover-ups. The initial investigation, led by Army CID, quickly points to a possible drug deal gone wrong. Both men were known to be involved in drug trafficking, with Lavigne owing money to local dealers. Investigators theorize Dumas was hired to kill Lavigne, but the plan went sideways, resulting in both men's deaths and a third, unidentified shooter. However, Harp highlights the inconsistencies in this narrative, noting the professional nature of the killings and the subsequent attempts to dispose of evidence, like Dumas' truck being burned far from the crime scene. This suggests a level of planning and expertise beyond that of typical criminals in the area. As the investigation unfolds, Harp reveals a troubling history surrounding Lavigne, including his controversial shooting of Mark Leshikar years earlier, a case that was quickly closed with a justification of self-defense. The author emphasizes that Lavigne was a troubled soldier, struggling with PTSD and addiction, and that his past actions were largely overlooked by the military. The discovery of a tattoo on Lavigne's chest, Until Valhalla, hints at a mindset common among special operations forces, a warrior ethos that can sometimes blur the lines between duty and recklessness. The investigation is abruptly taken over by the FBI, a move Harp portrays as a deliberate attempt to shut down the inquiry and protect those involved. The FBI seized all evidence gathered by CID, effectively halting the investigation into a potentially widespread network of corruption within Delta Force and other special operations units. Harp notes the close relationship between the FBI and Delta Force, suggesting a conflict of interest that hindered a thorough investigation. Harp details the fallout from the case, including the arrest of Amanda Tostado, Lavigne's girlfriend, on drug charges and her subsequent claims of being attacked by multiple men. He also points to the unsolved murder of specialist Enrique Roman Martinez, whose body was discovered months before Lavigne and Dumas were killed, adding another layer to the growing sense of a pattern of violence and cover-ups within the military. The author concludes by highlighting the frustration of the victims' families, who feel that the truth about these deaths is being deliberately concealed. Harp suggests that the military is protecting its own, shielding those responsible for these crimes from justice. He frames the events as a symptom of a deeper problem within the special forces, a culture of secrecy, impunity, and a willingness to overlook wrongdoing in the name of national security. The chapter sets the stage for a broader exploration of corruption and unsolved crimes within America's elite military units, hinting at a disturbing truth about the hidden costs of war and the sacrifices made by those who serve. Chapter 17, The Thumb Drive. Seth Harp details how the investigation into the deaths of Billy Lavigne and Timothy Dumas broadened to uncover a large drug trafficking operation linked to Freddie Wayne Huff, a former law enforcement officer. The FBI initially tipped Homeland Security investigations about Huff's alleged drug imports from Mexico, leading to a multi-agency task force. This task force included local police, the Highway Patrol, and even the sheriff's office led by Huff's friend, Bobby Kimbra. Huff, unaware of the growing investigation, knew he was suspected due to a recent falling out with Dumas. He claimed they had reconciled, but no one witnessed this meeting. While some of Dumas' associates believed Huff's story, others were suspicious, and key figures like a courier named Straight Up and an FBI analyst with ties to Dumas disappeared. A confidential informant then came forward, alleging Huff had offered to have people killed by Mexican hitmen and placed a bounty on someone who stole cocaine. The informant claimed Huff moved massive amounts of cocaine, potentially tons each year, and significantly reduced losses for the Los Zetas cartel. They also provided details about Huff's expensive lifestyle, including cars and houses. Following Dumas' death, Huff recruited Raheen Derriggs, a Marine sergeant specializing in supply chain management, essentially the same role Dumas had in the Army. Derriggs left active duty shortly before the murders. Authorities discovered Derriggs transporting over $200,000 in cash from Texas to Laredo, Texas, disrupting Huff's ability to purchase more drugs. This forced Huff to rely on a Puerto Rican trafficking organization led by a mysterious figure named Steven, who provided cocaine on credit with a violent threat if Huff couldn't pay. Huff's operation continued, but his gambling and spending habits created financial instability. A dispute with a gangster named 100K over the quality of cocaine escalated into a dangerous situation. Huff initially planned to kidnap 100K's mother, but was persuaded to target his associate, Tomont Williams, known as Rise. Huff and Derriggs disguised themselves as U.S. Marshals, using a fake vehicle and uniforms, and abducted Rise. They then threatened 100K with violence, securing a partial payment. However, 100K quickly betrayed Huff, claiming he never intended to pay. Facing threats from Steven and the fallout from the kidnapping, Huff sought a solution and learned that Michael Sosa, a local man, had the stolen cocaine. Huff then orchestrated a raid on Sosa's home, again using the U.S. Martial disguise, stealing cash, jewelry, and drugs. This reckless act ultimately led to his downfall. The raid on Sosa's home triggered the final phase of the investigation. Authorities connected the burner phone used in the raid to Huff, leading to a coordinated takedown. They arrested Huff, Rosado, Derriggs, and others, seizing millions of dollars worth of drugs, weapons, and cash. A crucial piece of evidence. a thumb drive allegedly containing a blackmail letter from Dumas naming members of a drug cartel within the special forces at Fort Bragg, was recovered but not immediately examined. Harp notes the irony of Huff's expertise in asset forfeiture, given the questions surrounding the missing money seized during the raid. Chapter 18, Acid is Life. Seth Harp begins unraveling a disturbing mystery surrounding specialist Enrique Roman Martinez, a soldier whose death coincided with other troubling events at Fort Bragg. Roman Martinez wasn't a typical Special Forces soldier. He worked in human resources and hadn't been deployed. However, his death, a beheading, and his secret life as a drug dealer added to the growing unease surrounding the murders of Billy Lavigne and Timothy Dumas. Many believed something was seriously wrong at the army base, and Roman Martinez's case felt connected. Harp details Roman Martinez's upbringing in California, highlighting a difficult childhood marked by poverty and a sensitive personality. His sister describes him as thoughtful, spiritual, and even struggling with depression. He became fascinated with psychedelic drugs like mushrooms and LSD, believing they could heal mental illness, and openly shared his views online, even using a social media handle, Tripon Roman. This interest would follow him into the army. Roman Martinez joined the army hoping for financial stability for his family and a path to pharmacy school, fueled by his belief in the healing power of psychedelics. He aimed for the elite Ranger Regiment, but lacked the physical strength and endurance. After completing paratrooper training, injuries sidelined him, leading to a desk job. Harp points out that drug use, particularly LSD, was common among soldiers in these types of units, a legacy stemming from Cold War-era CIA experiments at Fort Bragg itself, where soldiers were once voluntarily given LSD as part of mind control research. While stuck in a job he disliked, Roman Martinez began dealing drugs on base, obtaining supplies from Raleigh and Washington, D.C., and using a hidden drop point for transactions. He wasn't careful about hiding his activities, even posting pictures of himself using drugs while in uniform. Despite being placed on a watch list, little action was taken against him. Harp emphasizes that Roman Martinez was a complex individual, struggling with personal issues and seeking connection, but also involved in illegal activities. The narrative shifts to a camping trip Roman Martinez took with several fellow soldiers to Cape Lookout, North Carolina, in May 2020, a trip that violated pandemic travel restrictions. The group included a mix of ranks and personalities, and they all consumed LSD, except for a few. A storm rolled in, and Roman Martinez, already prone to anxiety and fear of storms, began to panic. He became convinced his friends had stolen his wallet and acted erratically, eventually disappearing during the night. Harp meticulously details the events leading up to Roman Martinez's disappearance, highlighting inconsistencies in the group's story and raising questions about what truly happened. The author notes the oddity of the storm itself, not being recorded by local weather stations. The search for Roman Martinez began slowly, with the group initially hesitant to report him missing, and eventually involving park rangers and ultimately the Army. The author sets the stage for a deeper investigation into the circumstances surrounding Roman Martinez's disappearance, hinting at a cover-up and a potentially darker truth behind his fate. Chapter 19, Evidence of Absence. The discovery of Enrique Roman Martinez's severed head on Shackleford Banks kicked off a complicated investigation, as Seth Harp details. The young soldier had disappeared after a camping trip with fellow paratroopers, and the gruesome way his body was found, brutally chopped and washed ashore, immediately pointed to murder, not an accident. An autopsy confirmed this, showing multiple, forceful blows and a precise cut to the neck, done with a sharp, heavy tool. As the Criminal Investigation Division, or CID, began looking into the case, they quickly focused on the 7 soldiers who had been with Roman. They had delayed reporting him missing, given inconsistent stories, and even seemed to try and cover up a break-in at Roman's room. The investigators learned the group had used drugs during the camping trip, adding another layer of suspicion. However, despite intense questioning, polygraph tests, and searches of their belongings. None of the soldiers confessed or provided solid evidence linking them to the crime. Harp points out a significant issue: a 48-hour delay before Fort Bragg's leadership alerted CID. This gave the soldiers time to potentially hide evidence. The investigation became massive, involving hundreds of interviews, computer searches, and even searches of the islands where they had camped. Yet, despite all this effort, concrete evidence remained elusive. Theories about motive, a traffic ticket, a bad drug deal, romantic tensions, all felt weak and lacked support. The author highlights the frustration of the investigators. They couldn't find a reason why anyone would want to kill Roman, and they couldn't find any physical proof connecting the soldiers to the crime. They even considered the possibility of suicide or an accidental death by a boat propeller, but the medical examiner repeatedly confirmed it was homicide. Harp notes the bizarre turn when CID clung to the boat propeller theory despite expert opinions to the contrary, seemingly desperate to close the case. Ultimately, the investigation stalled. CID charged the soldiers with lesser offenses, disobeying orders and making false statements, and they all pleaded guilty to avoid harsher penalties. But no one confessed to murder. Harp emphasizes that even with these convictions, the core mystery of Roman's death remained unsolved. He draws a parallel to other troubling cases at Fort Bragg, like the murders investigated in previous chapters, suggesting a pattern of problems within the Special Forces community. Harp reveals a disturbing trend. While this case was unfolding, Fort Bragg was experiencing a surge in deaths, suicides, overdoses, and other homicides. He points out that the base was dealing with a crisis, and the Roman Martinez case was just one piece of a much larger, darker puzzle. The author concludes by hinting at another murder within the same unit as one of the previous victims, suggesting the problems at Fort Bragg were far from over. The author's investigation reveals a system struggling with serious issues, where justice is difficult to achieve and the truth remains hidden. Chapter 20, Roid Rage. Seth Harp begins a troubling story about Keith Lewis, a soldier whose life took a dark turn after serving in Afghanistan. Lewis, a gentle animal lover before joining the military in 2008, experienced the horrors of war firsthand, witnessing death, and a disturbing video of civilian harm. This deeply affected him, causing anger, nightmares, and a personality change, according to his mother, Linda Lewis. The author highlights how war can change people, even those who seem least likely to be affected. After his deployment, Lewis trained as a medic and joined special operations groups. It was during this time that he began using steroids, a practice Harp reveals is common among elite soldiers seeking an edge. The author details a black market for these banned substances within the military, fueled by a desire to meet physical standards and fit into a culture of bodybuilding. Harp uses the case of Staff Sergeant David Rankine, who was involved in steroid trafficking and violent crimes, to illustrate the dangers of this underground network. Lewis's steroid use coincided with episodes of rage, culminating in a violent attack on his wife, Sarah, in 2016. Despite the severity of the assault and a subsequent standoff with police, the charges were dropped. Harp points out a pattern of leniency towards special operations soldiers, even when they commit crimes. The author emphasizes that Lewis continued to abuse substances and harm his wife, even after the birth of their daughter. Sarah repeatedly contacted Lewis's unit, pleading for help and warning them about his dangerous behavior, but her concerns were largely ignored. The situation tragically escalated on December 22, 2020, when Lewis shot and killed Sarah while she was trying to escape with their 3-year-old daughter. Their unborn child also died. Lewis then took his own life. Harp details the horrific scene, emphasizing the devastating loss of life. The author then shifts focus to a disturbing cover-up, revealing that Army officials falsely claimed Lewis's parents were deceased to seize his belongings and potentially hide evidence of wrongdoing. Harp uncovers evidence of widespread steroid use, finding syringes and vials in Lewis's home. He connects this to a series of unexplained deaths among Fort Bragg soldiers, including Captain Robert Latham, Sergeant Calvin Rockwood, and Major Eric Ewaldson, all of whom were physically fit but died from cardiovascular issues. The author suggests a possible link between performance-enhancing drugs and these deaths, though official records are closely guarded. Throughout the chapter, Harp criticizes the Army's lack of transparency and its tendency to protect its own, even at the expense of justice and accountability. Linda Lewis faced stonewalling from the military as she sought answers about her son's death and access to his medical records. Harp concludes by highlighting the systemic problems within the Special Forces, where a culture of secrecy and implicit tolerance for drug use allows dangerous behavior to flourish, with tragic consequences for soldiers and their families. The author suggests a pattern of covering up issues rather than addressing them. Chapter 21, Withdrawal Symptoms. Seth Harp begins an unsettling exploration into a disturbing pattern of deaths and crimes surrounding Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and the broader Special Forces community. Despite official reports suggesting a relatively calm period in 2020, the reality was far grimmer. 54 soldiers died at Fort Bragg that year, and another 54 in 2021, with very few casualties occurring during overseas deployment. Harp highlights that these weren't battle deaths, but a surge in suicides, overdoses, violent conflicts between soldiers, and unsolved murders, many labeled with the frustratingly vague, pending determination. The author details the tragic case of Private Caleb Smither, whose death was initially shrouded in mystery. His mother, Heather Baker, recounts finding her son's body badly bruised and receiving unsatisfactory explanations from the Army. While authorities attributed his death to bacterial meningitis, the lack of supervision after a head injury raised serious questions. This case, alongside others like that of Enrique Roman Martinez, fueled a sense of distrust and a belief that the Army wasn't fully investigating these incidents. Harp points out the disparity in media attention. While Fort Hood, Texas, received extensive coverage for a similar number of deaths, Fort Bragg's crisis was largely downplayed. Harp emphasizes the unusually high rate of deaths at Fort Bragg, far exceeding that of other military bases or comparable civilian cities. He notes the alarming rise in suicides, with the rate at Fort Bragg nearly triple the national average in 2020. Alongside this, a growing epidemic of drug abuse, particularly fentanyl, was sweeping through the base, contributing to a significant number of accidental overdoses. The author presents a series of heartbreaking cases: Specialist Christopher Jenkins, Jamie Boger, Christhiam Gonzalez-Pinda, and others, all victims of fatal overdoses, often involving a combination of drugs. The narrative then shifts to a broader pattern of misconduct within the Special Forces community, extending beyond Fort Bragg. Harp recounts instances of soldiers involved in drug trafficking, violent crimes, and even attempts to overthrow foreign governments. The case of Dan Good and Henry Royer, Green Berets caught attempting to smuggle cocaine out of Colombia, and the disastrous Bay of Piglets coup attempt in Venezuela illustrate a troubling trend of rogue behavior. Despite attempts by the Pentagon to address these issues, Harp suggests that a culture of impunity and a reluctance to acknowledge the extent of the problem hindered progress. Harp details how the Army attempted to address the drug problem at Fort Bragg through increased testing and security measures. However, these efforts proved largely ineffective, as evidenced by the case of Master Sergeant Martin Acevedo II, a repeat offender who continued to deal drugs even after being arrested. The author highlights the difficulties in prosecuting these cases, with lenient sentences and a tendency to protect soldiers, even those involved in criminal activity. The investigation reveals a disturbing pattern of cover-ups and a lack of transparency. Families of deceased soldiers, like Andrea Bracken, expressed frustration with the Army's lack of interest in thoroughly investigating their loved ones' deaths. Harp points out that the focus remained on portraying the issues as isolated incidents or reflections of broader societal trends, rather than acknowledging a systemic problem within the Special Forces community. The author concludes by noting the continued high rate of deaths and crimes at Fort Bragg, even after the withdrawal from Afghanistan, and the sense of despair among those connected to the base. Chapter 22, Permanent War. Seth Harp's investigation reveals a disturbing pattern surrounding the American military's involvement in the drug trade and a series of mysterious deaths connected to Fort Bragg, North Carolina. The chapter begins by exposing a long-held secret. For years, the U.S. government publicly blamed the Taliban for Afghanistan's massive heroin production, while quietly enabling it. Harp points out that once the Taliban regained control and banned poppy cultivation, this narrative fell apart, revealing a hypocrisy where the U.S. appeared to benefit from the drug trade while accusing others. The author details how the Taliban surprisingly eradicated the opium harvest, a feat lauded even by international observers, while simultaneously cracking down on addiction within Afghanistan through a controversial, forced rehabilitation program. Harp then shifts focus to the escalating crisis at Fort Bragg, detailing a surge in suicides and unexplained deaths among soldiers, particularly after the withdrawal from Afghanistan. The case of Sergeant Lane Coleman Jones, who took his own life, is presented as an example, with his mother questioning the official narrative and uncovering evidence suggesting foul play. The author highlights a pattern of drug use and dealing within the base, with soldiers openly buying and selling cocaine. Jo Lynn Jones-Kirshner, a military policewoman and the sister of Sergeant Jones, investigated her brother's death and found widespread drug activity, even encountering drug dealers near the police department. The narrative continues with the death of Sergeant First Class Christopher Kalashin, a veteran haunted by his experiences in Iraq. Harp details Kalashin's descent into addiction and the circumstances surrounding his overdose, noting the lack of a thorough investigation. The author emphasizes the troubling trend of soldiers struggling with moral injury and turning to drugs as a coping mechanism. Kalashin's story also reveals his involvement in covert operations in Ukraine prior to the full-scale invasion, hinting at the complex and often hidden activities of Special Forces personnel. As the war in Ukraine began, Harp notes the deployment of troops from Fort Bragg, including those under the command of Major General Chris Donahue, the same officer who staged a photo op during the Afghanistan withdrawal. The author reveals that Special Operations Forces were already operating covertly within Ukraine, engaging in activities beyond traditional warfare. This sets the stage for a broader discussion of the evolving nature of American warfare, increasingly reliant on secret operations and proxy forces. The chapter concludes with a series of disturbing incidents at Fort Bragg, including shootings and a particularly gruesome murder-suicide involving David Jensen, a Delta Force operative who killed his wife and then himself. Harp emphasizes the community's tendency to protect the reputation of Special Forces personnel, even in the face of horrific crimes. Finally, the author introduces Freddie Wayne Huff II, a drug trafficker who claims to have supplied large quantities of cocaine to a drug ring within the Special Forces, but whose information was seemingly ignored by the FBI. The chapter ends with a mysterious event at a nearby airport, hinting at further secrets yet to be uncovered. Harp suggests a systemic cover-up, where the military prioritizes protecting its image over investigating wrongdoing. Chapter 23, Fort Liberty. Seth Harp begins his investigation into a web of unsettling events surrounding Fort Liberty, formerly Fort Bragg, with the mysterious death of Charles Crooks in July 2022. Crooks, a newly licensed pilot working for a company supporting Special Forces operations, fell from a plane over a quiet neighborhood in North Carolina. The circumstances were strange: no parachute, falling in street clothes, and a lack of clear explanation. Harp quickly reveals this isn't an isolated incident, but a thread in a much larger, darker story. The author dives into the history of the Rayford Drop Zone, the airfield Crooks departed from, revealing a past riddled with accidents, fires, and suspicions of wrongdoing. The airfield's original owner, Gene Thacker, a Special Forces veteran, wasn't just a pilot and trainer. He was a notorious drug smuggler. Harp details how Thacker used the airfield to bring massive amounts of cocaine into the country, working alongside figures like Andrew Thornton too, the inspiration for the Cocaine Bear legend, and Bari Seal, a pilot involved in complex operations with the CIA. Despite numerous investigations, Thacker consistently evaded justice, aided by testimonials from fellow soldiers and, according to reports, even sabotage of his own planes by law enforcement. Harp explains that Thacker's son, Tim, continued the family business, shifting from cocaine to methamphetamine. He became a major drug supplier in North Carolina, operating alongside a network of connections while still running the airfield as a training ground for elite forces. The author highlights the irony of a facility used to train highly skilled soldiers, also serving as a hub for illegal activity. Billy Lavigne, a Delta Force soldier and HAHO instructor, worked at the airfield during this time, further connecting the special operations community to the illicit dealings. The narrative then shifts to the lack of thorough investigation into Crooks's death. The NTSB report, Harp points out, relied heavily on the unverified account of the pilot and offered no real explanation for the bizarre circumstances. This lack of scrutiny is presented as typical for the area around Fort Bragg, where strange occurrences often go unexplained. Harp illustrates this with a series of unsettling events: a coordinated attack on electrical substations, a surge in violent crime and mysterious deaths among soldiers stationed at Fort Liberty, and a large-scale drug bust that resulted in arrests but ultimately led to little prosecution. Harp emphasizes a pattern of investigations that stall or are quietly closed, often with the involvement of high-ranking officials. He notes the renaming of Fort Bragg to Fort Liberty as a symbolic gesture, but argues it doesn't address the deeper issues of corruption and misconduct within the base. The author details further cases of drug trafficking involving soldiers stationed at Fort Liberty, including a medic smuggling ketamine and an infantry officer running guns to West Africa. These cases, Harp suggests, are not isolated incidents, but symptoms of a systemic problem. Throughout the chapter, Harp paints a picture of a community shadowed by secrecy and a military base where illegal activities seem to flourish with little consequence. He suggests a culture where powerful individuals can operate with impunity, and where investigations are often hampered or shut down before reaching a conclusion. The author's detailed reporting and historical context lay the groundwork for a deeper exploration of the corruption and unsolved mysteries within America's special forces. Chapter 24, The Third Man. The investigation into the deaths of Billy Lavigne and Tim Dumas took a surprising turn in August 2023 when the FBI indicted Kenneth Morris Quick Jr., a young man with a troubled past, as the third man involved in both murders. Seth Harp details how this indictment came after a long period of silence from federal investigators, and it immediately raised questions. Quick, unlike the highly trained Special Forces soldiers Lavigne and Dumas, had no military background and came from a difficult life marked by drug dealing and run-ins with the law. Harp paints a picture of Quick as a young man deeply involved in the criminal world, detailing his arrests for shootings, resisting arrest, and a violent shootout that left one man dead. Even while facing multiple felony charges, including drug trafficking, Quick was then accused of murdering Lavigne and Dumas, along with disposing of Lavigne's body and burning Dumas' truck. The sheer volume of evidence, 68,000 records and a terabyte of data, was striking, yet remained largely unseen by the public. The reactions to Quick's indictment were mixed. Lavigne's mother, Judy, struggled to reconcile the image of her strong, well-trained son being killed by someone she saw as a scrawny little punk. She felt a strange sympathy for Quick, noting his youth and polite demeanor in court. Others, like Lavigne's friend Ben Bowden, questioned whether Quick had the skills to take down a seasoned Special Forces soldier like Billy. Dumas' son, TJ, was even more skeptical, finding it unbelievable that a 20-year-old would be associating with, let alone killing, men in their 40s with extensive military experience. Harp emphasizes the widespread disbelief surrounding the official narrative. many locals suspected a cover-up, believing that Lavigne and Dumas were eliminated by members of Delta Force or other Special Forces operatives. Courtney Williams, a former identity creator for Delta Force, fueled this suspicion, pointing to the unit's expertise in misinformation and cover-ups. She suggested the deaths were a result of internal conflicts within the secretive world of special operations. The author notes that Quick was already facing a lengthy prison sentence for other crimes when he was charged with the murders, leading some to believe he was simply a convenient scapegoat. The legal details surrounding the charges were also peculiar. Because Dumas was killed on Fort Bragg, the federal murder statute applied. However, Lavigne's death, believed to have occurred elsewhere, led to a more complex charge related to drug trafficking. Harp points out this distinction raised questions about the logic of Quick's alleged actions, particularly why he would bring a body onto a heavily guarded military base. Harp introduces a new layer of complexity through the testimony of Freddie Wayne Huff, a drug trafficker who claimed Dumas was writing a book exposing a corrupt network within the Special Forces. This network, according to Huff, enforced rules and silenced those who threatened it, potentially explaining the murders. Several sources corroborated the existence of a blackmail letter Dumas had allegedly written detailing this corruption. However, a crucial thumb drive containing a copy of the letter mysteriously went blank while in police custody, hindering the investigation. Seth Harp concludes by highlighting the deep-seated distrust within the Fayetteville community. While Quick may face trial, many remain convinced that the true perpetrators remain free, shielded by the power and secrecy of the Special Forces. The author suggests that the case is not simply about two murders, but about a potentially widespread pattern of corruption and violence within America's elite military units. And that brings us to the end of our summary of this book. I hope you found it insightful and valuable. If you enjoyed this video, hit like and subscribe for more. Your support helps us bring you more great content. Thanks for watching.